The Cursed Portrait. Chapter 1. The Auction. The auction house was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. Rows of chairs were filled with eager bidders, their eyes fixed on the items displayed on the stage. Among the antiques and curiosities was a hauntingly beautiful painting of a woman with piercing green eyes and a faint, enigmatic smile. Her gaze seemed to follow you, no matter where you stood in the room. Clara had always been drawn to art, especially pieces with a history. When the portrait came up for bidding, she felt an inexplicable pull, as if the woman in the painting was calling out to her. Without hesitation, she raised her paddle, outbidding everyone else. The portrait was hers. As she signed the final paperwork, a chill crept down her spine, though she quickly dismissed it as excitement. Chapter 2. The Arrival. The portrait arrived at Clara's apartment the next day, carefully wrapped in brown paper. She hung it above the fireplace in her living room, where the woman's eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. Clara couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as she stared at the painting, but she brushed it off as excitement. That night, Clara was awakened by a strange sound, a faint, melodic humming. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, and listened. The sound was coming from the living room. She grabbed her flashlight and crept down the hallway, her breath shallow. When she entered the living room, she froze. The portrait was glowing faintly, the woman's eyes now wide and filled with an unnatural light. The humming grew louder, more intense, and Clara felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She spun around, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the portrait and the oppressive silence that followed. Even when the sound faded, the feeling of being watched lingered. Chapter 3. The History. The next morning, Clara decided to research the portrait. She visited the local library, where she found an old book on cursed artworks. The portrait, it turned out, had a dark history. The woman in the painting was named Isabella Moretti, a 19th century socialite who had been accused of witchcraft. According to legend, Isabella had made a pact with a dark entity to preserve her beauty for eternity. The portrait had been painted shortly before her death, and it was said that her soul had been trapped within the canvas. Over the years, the portrait had passed through many hands, each owner meeting a tragic end. Some had gone mad, others had vanished without a trace. The portrait was believed to be cursed, a vessel for Isabella's restless spirit. Clara felt a chill run through her as she read the stories. She knew that she had to get rid of the portrait, but something stopped her. The woman's eyes seemed to plead with her, begging her to stay. It was as if an invisible thread connected her to the canvas, pulling her deeper into Isabella's story. Chapter 4. The Possession. That night, Clara was awakened by the sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway towards her bedroom. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and listened. The footsteps stopped outside her door, and the handle began to turn. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the door creaked open, revealing the silhouette of a woman. It was Isabella, her form faint and translucent, her eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. Isabella moved towards the bed, her whispers growing louder, more insistent. Clara tried to scream, but no sound came out. She felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through her body as Isabella's hand reached out to touch her. And then, everything went black. Chapter 5. The Awakening. When Clara woke up, she was lying on the floor of her living room, the portrait staring down at her. The woman's eyes were now filled with a strange, knowing light, and Clara felt a sense of dread wash over her. She knew that Isabella had taken control of her body, that she was now a prisoner in her own mind. She could feel Isabella's presence, cold and oppressive, lurking in the corners of her thoughts. Clara tried to fight back, but Isabella was too strong. She began to lose track of time, waking up in places she didn't remember going to, with items she had no recollection of acquiring. She could feel her consciousness slipping away, replaced by the cold, calculating mind of the woman in the portrait. Chapter 6. The Ritual. Clara knew that she had to do something. She sought out the help of a local occultist, a man named Dr. Elias Blackwood, who had studied the dark arts for decades. Dr. Blackwood told her of a ritual that could banish Isabella's spirit from her body, but it was dangerous. The ritual required her to gather certain herbs and objects and to perform a series of incantations. There was no guarantee that it would work, but Clara knew that she had no other choice. As she prepared, Clara began to notice changes in herself. Her reflection sometimes moved when she did not. Her handwriting shifted to an elegant, unfamiliar style, and she would catch herself whispering words in a language she did not know. Chapter 7. The Confrontation. That night, Clara performed the ritual. She stood in the center of her living room, the objects arranged around her in a circle, and began to chant the words of the incantation. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the apartment. Isabella emerged from the portrait, her form shifting and twisting, her eyes glowing with a cold, malevolent light. Clara continued to chant, her voice growing stronger, more confident. The room seemed to pulse with energy, shadows flickering wildly as Isabella screamed in fury. Her form began to fade, her whispers turning into desperate cries. And then, with a final deafening roar, Isabella was gone. Or so Clara thought. Chapter 8. The Aftermath. Clara sealed the portrait in a lead-lined box, determined to never let Isabella return. The apartment was quiet once more, the whispers gone, the air warm and inviting. But as she walked through the apartment, she noticed something strange. The shadows seemed darker, more pronounced, and she could feel a presence, cold and malevolent, watching her from the corners of her vision. She knew that Isabella was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. Clara often found herself standing in front of the sealed box, unaware of how she got there, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on its surface. Chapter 9. The Legacy. Clara never spoke of what happened with the portrait. She moved to a new city, determined to leave the past behind. But Isabella followed her. She could feel her presence, cold and oppressive, lurking in the corners of her mind. She knew that it was only a matter of time before Isabella returned. And when she did, Clara would be ready. Or so she hoped. Epilogue. The portrait still exists, hidden away in a dark, forgotten corner of the world. But sometimes, on a cold, dark night, if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers. The whispers of Isabella Moretti, calling out to you, begging you to come back. But beware, for once you enter, you may never leave. The end.